Hello listeners, Jordan here. I just want to let you know that you can listen to Nighttime early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime.
You are listening to the Nighttime Podcast.
Hello listeners. In tonight's episode, we're going to be discussing one of Nova Scotia's darkest days. On January 3rd of 2017, Afghanistan war veteran Lionel Desmond bought a semi-automatic rifle, dressed himself in camo, and snuck through the woods to his family's home. Inside the home, he shot his mother, his wife, and his 10-year-old daughter before turning the gun on himself. The factors that led to this horrific end and the red flags that were missed or ignored along the way were the topic of a public inquiry that now, 7 years after the killings and 4 years after the hearings begin, has just concluded. In this episode, a sort of eclipse in storytelling coverage and case analysis will occur, as co-host of the Sunday Night Show series, Adam Rodgers served as the deceased Lionel Desmond's legal representative in the inquiry. Thanks to his connection to the story, he's going to walk Paul Palango and I through the story of Lionel Desmond, the deaths of Lionel and his family, the search for accountability, and where it's all at today. So let's get into it. Mr. Adam Rodgers, Mr. Paul Palango, it's fair to say the three of us have survived Snowmageddon, or Snowvid, 2024. We don't need to complain about the weather because there's a hell of a lot of that going around Nova Scotia, so we'll spare everybody us flapping our gums about it. But let's start with this. Adam Rodgers, aside from breaking your back shoveling over the last few days, what's new with you?
I put in many hours of shoveling over the last few days, and it's great. I treat that like a workout, like a weights workout, right?
Yeah. In the best shape of my life.
You think of the technique and all these things, and don't hurt your back and all that stuff. But it's great, and great snowball snow too. So getting some early spring training in outdoors the last few days.
Absolutely. Mr. Palango, don't tell me you were out in your driveway risking your life on ice with a shovel.
I have people who do that.
The mafia boss of Chester Basin does not shovel his driveway.
No, it's I stopped shoveling driveways many years ago. Seeing people drop saying, "I had a great workout." Boom. I even had a brother-in-law who did that exact thing. So I learned not to shovel.
It's true. A mistake shoveling or going too hard shoveling, that can change your life. Absolutely. No question. So smart move, Paul. We need you to do other things aside from shovel. Mm-hmm. So what's been new with you, Paul? What's going on?
Well, we had the passing of broadcaster Rick Howe last week, who for 40 years or so, he's a journalist in the Maritimes, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. He ran the Daily Talk Show in Halifax for many years and was well loved and a very important person in the job that we're doing, because if it wasn't for him and Andrew Douglas at Frank Magazine, we wouldn't have got sort of as far as we did with the story about the mass casualty in Nova Scotia in 2020, because Rick Howe took it on. He became a believer in the story that there was something wrong, and he gave me and others airtime to talk about it.
And definitely broadcast that side of the story to an audience that wouldn't have found it reading the mainstream news, especially at that time in the early days. People
would think, oh, I don't listen to talk radio or anything like that. But in these days of shrinking news holes and indifferent reporting, you need every voice, and he was a very powerful voice in sort of moving the mountain of opinion that needed to be moved.
And an amazing speaker, could talk to anybody about anything. He's definitely missed in talk radio in Halifax. My condolences to all his friends and family and his wonderful wife, Yvonne.
Well, my condolences to both of them. And she's a great journalist too. So
69 years old, still many good years ahead, you would have thought. And it's very sad news.
No, definitely. So our condolences to him, but we got a lot to get into tonight. What we plan to discuss is, rather than a series of stories as we often do, focus specifically on the story of Lionel Desmond, the case that surrounds his death, the public inquiry that followed, and the recommendations that come out of that. I'm excited for this because we have a unique opportunity, because the three of us have followed the story, of course, since the beginning, but Adam has gone a major step forward. Where maybe before we touch on the story, Adam, just give us in a nutshell your role in this whole case at this point.
Yeah, so people would know me much from the Mass Casualty Commission, but this Desmond inquiry predated the Mass Casualty Commission, and this really where I became involved in this inquiry, representing the Desmond family, specifically representing the estate of the late Corporal Desmond through his sister Cassandra. So involved with the family, in the efforts to get an inquiry called. Helped with setting up the inquiry and some of those discussions, and then also represented them throughout the inquiry. So fascinating process throughout, quite an education, a different kind of an experience as a lawyer, certainly. Mm-hmm. But also to work with the family, that was quite something, an impressive group of people in unbelievably difficult circumstances.
Mm-hmm. To explain the circumstances, I'm going to play one news clip that aired just a couple days after the killing of Lionel's wife, his mother, and his 10-year-old daughter, and then Lionel's death as a result of self-inflicted gunshot. I'm going to play a news clip that aired just after that. The actual event happened on January 3rd of 2017. I think this news clip's about a week later.
Today, the search for clues continued. Police recovering Lionel Desmond's vehicle, and his family desperately looking for hints to how things could have gone so wrong.
Lionel was an amazing person, and that person that was in him that night, and that monster that was in him, that wasn't my brother.
On Tuesday evening, police were called to the Desmond family home. His wife, Shayna, who recently fulfilled a lifelong dream of becoming a nurse, was shot dead. So was their daughter Aaliyah, who just had her 10th birthday party last week, and Lionel Desmond's mother, Brenda, a woman known for her generosity. Police say the veteran of Afghanistan, who had struggled for years with PTSD, appears to have then shot himself.
Day 13, raise awareness for PTSD.
While in the military, Desmond received treatment and in Montreal after his release, according to his family. But still, he was hearing voices in his head.
My brother went to the hospital on Monday in Antigonish, St. Martha's, where his wife was a registered nurse. My brother told the hospital that he wasn't right, that something was wrong with him.
She says the local hospital turned him away. The province is investigating that claim.
So people new to the story who've just heard that will know that this is going to be a heavy discussion around a very heavy case. But the first thing about it that surprised me from the beginning of the story, and I'll ask you about this, Adam, is even in the early news clips, you hear Lionel's family talking about the perpetrator of a triple murder suicide as, that wasn't him. Whatever happened that night, that was not Lionel. And that seemed to be the narrative from the very beginning. What made it so clear to everybody that this was, like, what is the background that leads to this, that his family knows, this was not Lionel?
Like, he was such a nice guy, a gentle, happy-go-lucky, down on the floor, playing with the kids kind of a guy. And so, it was completely a different kind of a person. But I mean, that kind of that person that that I just talked about, that's before he went to Afghanistan. He came back from Afghanistan. He was changed. He was reserved. He had concussions, so he had some difficulties. But still, the thing the family had identified and some of them had witnessed was something that really didn't come through in the report, unfortunately. And I think this is a big problem we'll get into. Was that Lionel was having these dissociative episodes. He had post-traumatic stress disorder, but he had these episodes, and he had these in front of clinicians in medical appointments where he just wouldn't be there. His mind, he was somewhere else, and certain things could set him off. Loud music he couldn't stand, other things, but just stressful situation, and he might he had a dissociative episode and he just wouldn't be there. And there was a lot of things that happened in the day or two leading up to the tragedy. Everything seemed out of line. And so the thing that seemed to explain what had taken place was that he was in the midst of a dissociative episode during the tragic events. Mm. And there was anyway, there seemed to be lots of evidence pointing in that direction. All of his, he's all dressed up, he's doing things all day, he's making appointments for the future, and then all of a sudden he's in camouflage, sneaking through the woods to his house. So that was, I guess that's the foundation of it. There's more details, of course, but that's kind of what the family felt when this all happened, and never ever stopped expressing their love for him.
Mm-hmm. There was in that clip we just heard, they describe him going to the hospital for help. I'm not feeling right, either the day of or in the days before. I know it seemed to be there was some doubt about whether or not that happened. What do you know about Lionel's pursuit of therapy or some kind of intervention of what was going on? Like what came out from that?
So he was not turned away from the hospital. That was discovered fairly early on, that was a misunderstanding, that somebody just had the misunderstanding that he was turned away. He had been to the hospital at St. Martha's. He didn't go to the third floor. People around Antigonish would know when you talk about the third floor, that's the mental health wing at St. Martha's. He was taken because his wife worked there to a room at emergency, like just a side room there to just relax for a bit. Mm. And that was all he needed. He dealt with a doctor, came back again, spoke to a psychiatrist. So he did receive treatment at the hospital in the days leading up. So that was, he actually saw two different mental health professionals, I think, during that time.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, the thing about Desmond was that this was going on for a long period of time. I mean, he was diagnosed with, major depression in 2007. In 2015, he was having persistent dreams about his wife being unfaithful to him, and, and violent imagery of stabbing her and the man involved. He had paranoid and homicidal thoughts almost on a daily basis. I mean, he wasn't getting the treatment that he should have been getting in this situation.
There was times like early on when he was in treatment where he seemed, you could almost see the ebbs and flows of it as we went through the evidence. There was times early on where he seemed to be doing quite well, and then he had there was a racial incident with chocolate milk on base, and then he had a setback because he thought all his comrades hated him or something, and he would have these setbacks. But there was a key. You're right there, Paul. Like when he came back from when he was discharged, he went like months without any treatment. This is in the months leading up to the tragedy. So he had no care provided for him for like 3 months, 4 months at one point there.
Isn't there at one point where he has like 6 different psychiatrists looking after him? Like there's no consistency. There's no one person taking charge of the situation. So he's getting rather indifferent care, which is sort of the problem that we get right through the medical system nowadays.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And this didn't come out in the report, but they had this situation in Montreal, and he started to be, he said, suspicious of his caregivers. Like they were just trying to process him or something, and they weren't, because he didn't feel like they were really getting to him, right? So he was persistent in trying to get help, but they just couldn't seem to figure him out.
When was it, just to get a sense of the timeline, when did he get back from Afghanistan, roughly?
So he was in Afghanistan in 2007. It was a while ago. So there's another thing, like, because this was a provincial inquiry and not a federal inquiry, we didn't get into the question of what happened, how do you prepare a soldier for battle? Mm-hmm. We asked a few witnesses about that, but we didn't get into it very deeply because that's federal territory and it's not subject to, it's not within the jurisdiction of the inquiry. Mm-hmm. Really a shortcoming, because, I mean, that's where it all happened. He concussions. He had, they were in firefights every day for hours and hours and hours. And, that messed him up. It messed a bunch of people up.
Certainly. So if he comes back in 2007, 2008ish, this doesn't happen until almost 10 years later. When did his trouble start with PTSD, and when was it obvious that Lionel had changed?
Like treatment started a couple of years later.
Mhm.
He tried to deal with it on his own, and
Mhm.
then the treatment started. He was still in the military. He was, put in a band, which for a guy with some concussions and head issues didn't seem like a great idea in retrospect, but they needed to put him somewhere. He was learning some, mechanical skills and such. But mostly, yeah, being around Gagetown and
Mhm.
doing
Mhm. And
doing
then
doing work, but no return to combat.
and Paul had mentioned a period of time in 2015 where it seemed to really become a problem. My understanding is in 2015 he was arrested in New Brunswick under some kind of mental health emergency that he was having that led to him having his firearms license suspended. I'm assuming that in the inquiry, looking at how he got the firearms became an issue. And I just find it surprising that only 2 years before the killings, he had his firearms license suspended. What is the story with that?
Yeah, so in 2015, he had called his wife and said, say goodbye to Aaliyah and all that stuff. Sounded suicidal.
Mhm.
So she called the police. Some police came over, spoke to him, took him to the hospital, spent a few hours with him, had great interaction with him. It sounded like they testified about it, and then took him home later that night. He was doing better. Took his guns though.
Mhm.
Uh, there was a report registered in New Brunswick on that in the New Brunswick system, but that report never made it to the New Nova Scotia system.
Mhm.
So it wasn't seen as it wasn't part of the relevant mix when he went to get his license renewed again in Nova Scotia.
Well, another issue like that strikes me about this that's really important, similar to what you're talking about, is like Dr. Scott Terrio, a psychiatrist who examined him, said that one of the issues, looking at the problems that this guy was facing, went beyond PTSD and depression. There was something fundamentally wrong, and he said that in reviewing the case, if he had been his psychiatrist, he would have wanted to talk to his wife,
Yeah.
got permission to talk to his wife to better assess the situation. But in this day and age, everyone's reluctant. It's privacy, privacy, privacy,
Mhm.
and people are not being protected because they don't want to ask. Could I talk to your wife and your family so I can get a better sense of this situation and to provide, with more knowledge comes more security in a way, because if someone knows about what's really going on and has a better fix on it, they might have been able to take firmer action and prevent this tragedy.
A great resource too, Paul, where she was a nurse and had been involved in his care often enough that and of course knew him before and after. I mean, she knew him basically from the time he was a kid, right? So was somebody that could have really spoken about all of those issues and been helpful as a resource, but wasn't used that way.
I want to get a bit more on the gun thing, Adam, because he has his firearms license suspended in 2015. He gets it back. My understanding is he buys a gun like either the day of or the day before the killings. Can you talk me through kind of the timeline of how he ends up getting like a semi-automatic rifle in the middle of obviously a mental health crisis with years of PTSD treatment behind him? Like what is the timeline of that?
No, there were two incidents around the same time in 2015. There was one in Nova Scotia where Lionel had been upset and Shayna had called the police and the police showed up and Lionel had taken off. He'd gone cool his head, go for a walk. By the way, like as I said, never any allegation of violence. by anybody between the two of them before this, of course. So the police showed up and talked to Shayna, and but the Nova Scotia police and the New Brunswick police have no way of knowing that the other incident has happened, right? And then when Lionel goes to get his license renewed in New Brunswick, he has to get a medical form signed. He gets it signed by his psychologist. It says, he seemed to be doing better, and he didn't have all these details. He didn't have access to the, criminal history or anything like that. It just seemed to be doing better, and so he got the license. There was one other thing though, which was in the military, he was not permitted to have a firearm. He wasn't on base during exercises because of these mental health concerns. And he was undergoing treatment within the military. Like, they wouldn't allow him on base to have a gun. But when he goes out into the civilian world, he's allowed. And the two systems, again, are not connected. Even though firearms is a federal responsibility, it's administered through the provinces. And so the federal military system and the federal but really provincial firearms system don't connect in any way. So one of the recommendations is, by the way, here's the report. That's how thick it is. Not a bit of color anywhere in this report. They don't have the Mass Casualty Commission budget. Yeah, he was not allowed firearms within the military, but could in civilian life.
So he gets his firearms license back in Nova Scotia in 2016, despite all this everything else behind him that's gone on.
He got the firearms license back in New Brunswick.
He did, okay.
But it was valid in Nova Scotia. You have your purchase and acquisition license, and so now one of the recommendations is if you have employment restrictions respecting firearms, you have to disclose that in your firearms applications in civilian life.
Okay, so should he have disclosed that?
No, there was no requirement at the time for him to do that.
Okay,
he did. He answered every question he was to be asked that had to be answered, and so within the system, as it exists, really. He got his license legitimately and kept it legitimately.
Okay. Do you know, now, I don't know if this came up in the inquiry at all, and we'll get into that, but do you know if people close to him, like his wife specifically, knew that he was going through the process of getting his firearms license back? Because that seems like something where if I was involved in this, I'd be like, oh, I don't know, Lionel, like we may want to wait on that.
I think not sure if the spouse is automatically notified. Can't remember.
Okay.
But she knew he had a license. She knew he had a POW because he had firearms. He had firearms in New Brunswick at one point, had them taken away. So I don't know, maybe she thought that they took away the license too, but no, I think she would have known he got it back.
Mm-hmm. Well, talk through, like, we talked a lot about the getting and not having a firearms license, but how does it go down with him getting the semi-automatic rifle that he used for the murders?
All right, so we tried to track his actions on the day of, and you can do this a little bit by text messages and where he was and all this stuff. But so he ends up in the afternoon. So he goes to Antigonish first thing in the morning. Later in the morning, around lunchtime, confirms an appointment with his psychologist for later in the month. Mm-hmm. All right, comes back home, turns around and goes back to Leaves and Limbs in Antigonish. So there was a strange thing in itself. He was already in Antigonish, drives over half an hour back, and then turns around and goes back to Leaves and Limbs. Buys this gun.
Leaves and Limbs is like a firearms store?
Yeah, it's a firearms outdoor store. It's a good store. Man, the guy that owns it is Daniel Kalanick, testified in the inquiry, and he was just like he racked with guilt. Didn't do a thing wrong. He knew Lionel's grandfather. Lionel gets to the store, and we see video of this. And Judge Zimmer had one of the psychologists examine the video of him in the store. He's as patient as could be. He's more patient, than any anybody you'd see. Like if if somebody didn't have their phone, like he was just standing there, he was looking at things. Anyway, so he buys a used gun. He doesn't buy a new gun. He doesn't buy a cheap, just give me the cheapest gun, let me get out of here. He buys a used gun, gets a good deal on it, gets nice ammunition, doesn't get the cheap ammunition, gets the stuff that, anyway. So again, it all seemed to be a good long-term purchase, not something designed to just do something that day and be done. So, and he had his card. He was a legitimate purchase. And by the way, the store, the Leaves and Limbs, took all the information down and kept all records of all this stuff, which is not required. They went above and beyond what they had to do, check the database and all this stuff. Stores don't even need to do that. They can just take your PAL, your card, and sell you a firearm and not keep records of all that. Anyway, so that's another recommendation. But yeah, it was a strange thing to watch him in the store, just the way he was behaving.
Wow. And how long from purchasing this used rifle does he actually go through with what happens?
About an hour and 20 minutes or so.
Okay. And I don't know if do people at this point, like, is it one of those things where it's people know what went on in the house, or is there still a question of what actually even happened?
No, people know. There was some doubt as to the order of death, but that was more or less resolved. I mean, his mother seems to have died last, and they had the angles of all the shots and stuff. They were able to examine all the entry and exit wounds and such. But the mother was able to make a phone call and call her brother to say, get over here. But that was within minutes. He was within minutes. Actually, Lionel's sister, not unexpectedly, but showed up minutes later. So could have been worse too. But yeah, he parked. So he comes back from Leaves and Limbs. He parked his vehicle in the woods. Took them days to find this vehicle. That news report you said about a week later, like that, it took some time. His uncle and this other guy went and looked for it. The uncle had an idea where it might be. He snuck through the woods, through a path in the woods, stabbed her tires, slashed her tires on the truck. And then went into the house. Seems to have killed his wife first.
Okay.
But also, here's an interesting thing, and a name that you'd be familiar with, Corporal Rose Berthume, was one of the investigators. Had a theory. Well, here was the evidence, was that it was I think a 10 clip magazine or something. But he took the clip out of the gun before, leaving only one bullet in before he shot himself. And Corporal Rose Berthume thought, and a few others thought, it was put to others and they agreed, was him being a firearms expert would have known that gun would now be safe if anybody showed up at the house, that it would still have a clip left in it that some kid might pick up, or somebody that doesn't know what they're doing could pick up. And so his last thought, in a sense, was to keep somebody safe, whoever might come upon the scene.
Wow.
Isn't that something?
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. This case, much like Portapic, it didn't, the inquiry wasn't a given right off the bat. This is something that his family had to advocate for and put some public pressure out there for. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so this was like Cassandra and her sister went to Ottawa, lobbied the Veterans Affairs Minister, Seamus O'Regan at the time, nothing. Lobbied the Premier and the Justice Minister, Mark Fury, nothing. Went and spoke to Dr. Matthew Bowes, the Chief Medical Examiner. I was there with them when they met with him. And Dr. Bowes, you could see, was quite affected by the whole thing, and wrote to Justice Minister Fury saying, here, laid it all out in a couple of page letter. I think you should call an inquiry. And the minister wrote back, no, and here are all the reasons why not. Bose writes again, basically saying, you don't call an inquiry, I'm going to call an inquiry. Why don't you call the inquiry? I could force you to do it under this legislation, and I can point this out to you. And I asked Dr. Bose at the inquiry, I said, were you, well, I can't remember exactly how I put it, were you trying to, give a subtle hint that he should call the inquiry? Dr. Bose said, I didn't think I was being very subtle. So he was basically, the provincial government, federal government never wanted this to happen. It was forced upon the provincial government by Dr. Bose and his courage.
But
Wow.
isn't that the larger problem that we face? We saw in Portapic and in everything else that's pretty well happened with large federal institutions like the RCMP and the military. The government never really wants to do anything, because it's too big a problem to handle.
Yeah.
And I mean, the very same players who were involved in Portapic were involved in this. Fury, even the lead investigator, Gerald Rose Berthoum from the RCMP, same guy in Portapic.
Some other familiar name, Addie McCallum, was involved.
McCallum was in both of them.
Yeah, you're right, Paul. Like the reticence to make any major changes was something, and you could see it at both levels. Like Veterans Affairs, I described it in my closing argument. You guys know the Kafka novel, The Castle, like this bureaucracy where, this town and there's a castle and everybody in the town knows somebody that works in the castle, but nobody's ever actually been there or knows it really functions, whatever, right? It's just a unnavigable bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. And that's what Veterans Affairs is. Mm. Would you want your, niece, nephew, grandchild, whoever, joining the military, knowing that if they go see combat somewhere, they might come back completely messed up and nobody's going to know how to deal with them. Nobody's going to prepare them properly. Nobody's going to, and if they kill their family, nobody's going to come around and organize the funeral.
If you're a woman in the military, it's a bad, like U.S. in the U.S. I mean, the U.S. Department of Defense statistics show like almost 10% of women and 1.5% of men are sexually have unwanted sexual contact while they're in the military. And I'm sure the numbers are much higher than that.
Probably, yeah.
That's the reported numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, in the Desmond case, in terms of getting to the inquiry, this is a case where it seems only natural that there would be one, where we've already heard how he was able to fall through the cracks just as a result of the bureaucracy and the lack of communication between the provinces and between the military and the civilian world. It seems like a public inquiry would be the only venue to really get all the players at the table to have a discussion. Was that kind of the motivation to have a public inquiry, is to connect all these different kind of silos?
Yeah, it was the biggest thing that seemed like an obvious problem, and a problem that affected what happened and led to what happened, was, the complete disconnect between the federal and provincial health systems. Mm-hmm. Here he was, one of the more complex cases that you could see coming out of a military situation, and those are complex to start with. He has concussions, he has the PTSD, he has dissociative episodes, and here he is coming back into a provincial system, and nobody knows who he is other than, he was in the provincial system as a kid, and he had, maybe a broken bone. I don't remember. He had very little medical history before the military. Uh-huh. And there's just no way of, like, those records they're not given to the soldier when they leave. They're not transferred from federal to provincial jurisdictions. They're just nowhere. They're just held by the federal government and military. And so that transition is a big thing. And then the other side of the transition, the social side, the military had all these like PowerPoint slide presentations and documents and stuff on how to reintegrate with your family after military service, after combat. And none of it actually gets done. Like, you talk to certain families, all right, how much of this actually happens? None. So there's a real disconnect between when a soldier leaves the military to return to civilian life. Like there's
Mhm.
there's just nothing done. They're just left to their own devices.
Well, it sounds like a scene out of First Blood, the Rambo movie. But
Well, yeah.
it's yeah, with Lionel Desmond when he's seeking when it's apparent there's a problem and he's struggling and he's seeking therapy or support from the hospital. It, with him with his background as a soldier, does that come into play at all, or would it be as far as the treatment he gets, or would it be just like if I went to the hospital, like he would just go in to patients or the emergency room or something and say what's going on? Like I'm just wondering how he accessed healthcare when these problems started.
Same as you and me, except with one caveat. I made this conclusion too during the inquiry. It's like everybody outside of the military and Veterans Affairs world
Mhm.
treated Lionel Desmond great. Like they went out of the way for him. Like there was an on-call psychiatrist that came in that's supposed to just see him and then like send him off to somebody. Said, okay, you're not connected yet to the operational stress injury clinic in Halifax. Well, I'll keep you as a patient until you are.
Okay.
Doctors in here in Guysborough. The two doctors that were here in Guysborough at the time, one's still here. Both had experience in war. One came from Sri Lanka, the other came from somewhere in Africa where there'd been some conflict, and so like we're able to talk to him a little bit, right? And so he did have, and people gave him lots of time and tried to help, but they just couldn't get to know him. Like the therapist that was seeing him that had done some work with this dissociative episodes and PTSD here that was based in Antigonish saw him like twice, and she's like, I'm gonna need 6 or 7, 8 sessions just to do the baseline with this guy. So imagine if she had been just, all right, actually here's 8 reports on him, how about you read those to help out, but they were never provided.
Was there any sense, you were close to this, was there any sense of brain damage other like the concussions? I understand, but was there any post-mortem investigation into the nature of the brain damage he may have suffered?
I asked about that. There were 3 documented concussions that he had. One was a parachute accident. Another was, during combat. 2 during combat. One was a lav rollover, and another was where a mud wall collapsed under him and he hit his head hard. So, I asked a question about, unfortunately, of course, when the way he killed himself, that just wasn't possible in his case. But I asked the chief medical examiner, the office here, if they do any of those studies, because you hear about this in NFL football players, that they'll study their brains and see what kind of damage the football did to them. Right? They weren't able to do it for him, but I think they should look at that if the opportunity comes, in other soldiers.
Now you represented his estate in the inquiry, but you've already described times before the inquiry is even called that you're there with his family. At what point do you get involved in this story, and what was the original purpose of your involvement, if you can say?
Well, the first time I was involved, it was just going to a vigil right over at in Upper Big Tracadie.
Yeah, because this is basically in your hometown where this hall takes place.
This is about 20 minutes away from here. I go by this house all the time. Anytime, like everybody does. Anytime you go to Antigonish or Port Hawkesbury, you're going to pass this the Desmond home, well, Borden home. So, but I had, I knew lots of people in the family and knew Cassandra. So they called me up just to help out with meeting with Dr. Bose, trying to figure out that side of things, and who do they even talk to? So just helping to set that part up.
It's almost like another failure. Like you would think the military would have someone kind of leading this for the family, where Cassandra his sister doesn't have to be on the news calling for an inquiry and all this on her own. We see the same thing with Portapic, where it's left to the grieving families to like publicly advocate for themselves.
And there's a lot of complicated stuff with the estate and all that stuff too, to deal with life insurance and so there was these other details. But yeah, yeah, I mentioned the funerals. So after his passing, nobody from Veterans Affairs showed up to arrange the funerals, pay for the funerals. Nobody knew who was going to do what. Fortunately, Lionel's mentor, his uncle, a guy named Junior McClellan, retired warrant officer, had his own struggles though with PTSD, but Lionel's grandfather called him up and said, "Junior, I need your help." And so Junior shows up to his own detriment, made all the phone calls, made all the arrangements, used his experience as a warrant officer to do that, and was really heroic under the circumstances. Unfortunately, I never really made it to the report, but that was an important detail. Mm-hmm. Again, because it's not a federal report, there's no point criticizing Veterans Affairs, but you end up leaving out important parts of the story as a result.
Yeah, well, tell us. We'll get into the inquiry now because it's not maybe just explain that one more time. This inquiry was only looking at Nova Scotia's role in all the aspects of Lionel's case.
Yeah, so it's a fatality inquiry. You're looking into the cause of death, what caused it, but you can get a little broader than the specific thing that caused it, and look into, did he receive proper health care? Did he have access to proper mental health supports, proper domestic violence intervention supports, those kinds of things, all under the provincial government jurisdiction.
Okay. It just seems though, like in his story so far, our conversation now is bouncing so much between, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, the federal government through the military and all this. It just seems like to really get to the bottom of what went wrong in this case, all of these players need to be at the table.
You're absolutely right. Like, I remember early on thinking, oh, we'll probably go to Afghanistan. like shouldn't we go check this place out and see, what kind of hellhole are we sending our soldiers into? Like, this was, I don't know, seemed like a relevant question. And we had a couple of doctors, I remember one specifically saying, anytime, this was the cannabis doctor out of New Brunswick, who set up sort of modern legions, except they're cannabis-based. Anyway, he was saying anytime he talks to somebody who was in Afghanistan in 2007, he doesn't have to say another word. He just knows it's going to be bad. Like that was just a bad time to be there. So
here's a question for you.
Yeah.
How many fatality inquiries have there been in Nova Scotia, say in the last 24 years? I've got the answer.
Okay, I was going to say maybe 2 or 3 others.
That's right, 3 others. There's been 4 in 24 years.
Yeah.
Adam Como in 2000, Donald LeBlanc in 2007, Howard Hyde in 2009. It's probably a very useful inquiry to have, probably more on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think
to keep the system honest and to provide accountability of some sort, but it's rarely used. So it's that's disturbing in and of itself.
Yeah,
I would think that in the old days, back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, especially 70s, 80s in Ontario where I was, there'd be coroner's inquests, which are essentially this on a regular basis. Any kind of death where there was a question that there may be some culpability somewhere in the system, they would have a coroner's inquiry. It was like a jury. You'd go into the courtroom and there'd be a panel, and I sat through many of them. And I thought they were pretty useful exercises for getting into the structure of what happened.
Yeah, like in this case, you say, well, there's nobody, you can't say, all right, it's this person's fault. I mean, it's nobody's fault, and it's a whole bunch of people's fault because it's a system problem, and this is the way to address a system problem.
Absolutely, that's what it's for.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This review, inquiry, inquest, it has its own story because it goes on for ages. It's interrupted by the pandemic. Talk a bit about the journey through this.
Yeah,
last, I guess, 4 years now that's been going on.
Okay, so I wrote a few dates down just because it's good to remember things.
Yeah.
May 21, 2019, there were some opening remarks made. So the inquiry was called February 14th, 2018. A year and a bit later, we have our opening remarks. That's time spent, I think, trying to organize a database of evidence and all these kinds of things, get those established. March 2nd, 2020. Sorry, we start hearing evidence in January of 2020, January 27th, and then it goes to March, and then we get the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
No, so this was taking place in Guysborough, it's municipal office, actually just up the hill from me, and in a former, it used to be a courtroom, but it was a municipal chambers. It was made into an inquiry room. It was working quite well. Near where the family lived, people coming to watch. It was great. Then we get the pandemic, and they decide that it needs a bigger space, even though the municipality says they were never asked whether they could accommodate under the rules, and could have, they say. It was moved to Port Hawkesbury to the bigger courtroom. So it's a year later that we get back into hearings in February of 2021. Go for 25 days into June of 2021, break until September, do another 9 days, September, October, November. I've just scattered evidence, like witnesses that didn't get into the earlier sessions. And then we did our closing arguments April 20th, 2022. All right. And then from there on, Judge Zimmer was writing his report up until about, well, it was about a year on that he was still writing his report when he was pulled off the gig by the provincial government because he had aged out. He was 75 years old. He'd been extended a couple of times, but judges have a mandatory retirement age. And the province just decided not to extend him any further. And then we got a new judge, and the new judge, Judge Scoville, took about 6 months to write his report. So there's the saga of the inquiry.
Wow.
The families have been in and out of courtrooms for 7 years.
I miss my mom internally and deeply. My brother as well, all of them.
On January 3rd, 2017, Corporal Lionel Desmond legally bought a semi-automatic rifle. A few hours later, he shot and killed his wife, Shayna, their 10-year-old daughter, Aaliyah, and his mother, Brenda. He then fatally shot himself. The tragic end to the rifleman's battle against PTSD after serving 2 tours in Afghanistan. The inquiry heard how Desmond and his healthcare providers struggled to access his military health records and how he faced delays in trying to get care through both Veterans Affairs Canada and provincial health services, leading to what the judge called, quote, a large crack in psychotherapy through which Corporal Desmond fell.
This has been an arduous and emotional process.
Judge Paul Scoville's recommendations include making sure Ottawa provides a case manager to veterans as they transition out of service, and that the Nova Scotia government improve the transfer of health records by working with other provinces and federal agencies, along with ensuring frontline workers get up-to-date information on intimate partner violence. Other recommendations focus on better background checks and reassessments for firearms licenses.
Nothing here relates to assisting the Borden family for the tragedy that took place.
But for Shayna Desmond's family, the report is a disappointment. They still live in the home where the killings happened and say Veterans Affairs has ignored their pleas for help.
The first way to begin to help the families heal is to help the family with relocating.
The federal minister only saying overall changes have been made.
We certainly want to move forward in improving any services that we can in order to make life better for our veterans and also their family members.
The inquiry recommends a special committee to track progress on the recommendations so they're not lost, the judge said, to the passage of time after the families have spent so long waiting.
Now, we've talked a lot in the lead up to this report coming out. It's now finally in the public's hands. Tell us about the report and the reaction to it.
The report, and I've did a couple of interviews where I mentioned this fact that the change of judge made a huge difference. All right. Oh, yeah. And this is no way disrespectful to Judge Scoville, who did as good as could be under the circumstances. but those were the circumstances. Here we had Judge Zimmer, who was one of the top criminal lawyers in the province before he was named a judge. Had a great reputation as a judge, and this was the culmination of a great legal career. Like, he was involved, I think, in the Hyde inquiry, certainly one of the others as counsel as well. So, and had been thinking about this case and nothing but this case for 5-6 years. So Judge Scoville comes along and does a very functional report. He gets the main recommendations correct, but there's no flavor to it, right? And where Judge Zimmer, during the hearings, were very critical of Veterans Affairs, and, I think would have been a little less concerned with the jurisdictional niceties and would have just said what he was thinking. And he must have had other theories on Lionel that, Judge Scoville just couldn't have coming. It's like doing your exam when you didn't go to the class, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did a good job, but could have been a lot better if Judge Zimmer had done it.
Mm-hmm. Now, this report ends with recommendations, much like what we got from the Mass Casualty Commission. What is your feeling on the recommendations that come out of this? Do they address, the root cause and problems and what happened?
They do, except with this, one big exception where they don't talk about the dissociative episodes and the possibility of that, because that explains a few other things, right? Because they talk about one thing, they talk about domestic violence services not being in place, and that's probably true. We saw that in the mass casualty as well. But they also say, all right, everybody involved in this family, the police officers, the counselors, everybody else, seems to have missed all the signs. Yeah, possibly. Or maybe there weren't that many signs, and he killed his wife and his family in the midst of a dissociative episode. The same with Dr. Yoshi, who signed the firearms license. He says, well, he seemed to be doing well. Yeah, okay, well, maybe Dr. Yoshi missed the signs, or maybe he was doing well, except for when he had these episodes. I don't know. It's I wish that the report had grappled with that question and made a conclusion one way or the other. I guess that's where I feel there's been a shortcoming. And I mean, just the function of it being a provincial inquiry, not joint provincial federal, that limited the scope of what it was going to examine in the first place.
Isn't that the way to do it, though? The way government does it, they set the parameters for an inquiry, and that's part of what I'm writing about in my next book. Is inquiries only do what they have such the parameters are often so narrow and so contorted. They get the answer they want before they even sit down. The commission even sits down, or the inquiry begins to hear evidence.
In this case, Paul, they would have known probably by the time they called the inquiry that the hospital hadn't done anything wrong. So their main fear of liability, that the hospital had turned him away, that was kind of out of the picture. And there was going to be some recommendations about coordinating with the federal systems. That's more on the federal Veterans Affairs. So, all right, let's keep it within these confines. We're going to come out okay. And then we could, if not, if it looks like it might be bad, we'll just replace the judge at the end.
Oh, welcome to Canada and Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
That's how it works.
Yeah. Like anyway, the racial side of things that part came up too. Is like, look at how much money they spent at the Portapic inquiry and not here. Can't even get a color cover page, right? And
the website is pretty early 2000s vibe to it as well.
Yeah, but of course, I mean, that was all that was needed, really. The Mass Casualty Commission should have pulled back to this level, probably was the answer. But anyway, there was a noticeable difference when he was unceremoniously shown the door. By the way, not invited to the release either. Judge Zimmer made the point of saying about the Mass Casualty Commission that they had 3 commissioners and like 30 staff and however many people reading through these documents. This is a judicial inquiry. I've got to read these all myself and do all the writing myself. Like, nobody's doing a first draft of anything.
Wow.
So, in other words, it definitely wasn't taking him too long to write the report.
So what comes next? And with the recommendations come out of the Desmond report, is there any discussion now on anything changing or anything coming out of this?
Well, no. So there is an implementation committee.
Mm-hmm.
Different setup, slightly different setup than the Mass Casualty Commission. The Mass Casualty Commission had a person from all different kinds of organizations, including family representatives. This is a group of senior bureaucrats from the relevant departments of the provincial government
Mm-hmm.
with a up to a minimum 5-year mandate. That's it. That's all they really say about it. They don't invite the family to be involved. They don't say it should be public. They don't do any of those things. So it doesn't fill one with confidence that there's going to be a parade of recommendations being fulfilled.
Okay. Well, that's not very
No,
uplifting.
like I mean the Desmond, I mean it's hard to believe they still have the energy to keep fighting, but they will keep pushing to make sure these changes happen because there's a lot of military families that are providing support. There's a community around this, but it's not going to happen of its own volition. One wouldn't.
There's a few questions I want to ask you, and I don't know if you can answer these, but there are some parts of this story that a lot of people discuss as possibly being involved, and I just want to get it straight from the horse's mouth. Is there's a discussion about Lionel being given some kind of like controversial medicine or therapy when he was in Afghanistan that some people believe could lead to violent behavior. Do you know of did anything related to that come out in the inquiry?
It certainly came up many times. Mefloquine is the
What is this?
Anti-malarial drug.
Okay.
There's a class action taking place out of Toronto. I was in touch with the lawyer about it. There was no evidence discovered that Lionel Desmond took mefloquine or was administered it, but it was raised many times. So anyway, it's raised in a way and not dismissed, I guess with 100% certainty.
Okay.
A lot of people, and I wouldn't be shocked to hear that he took it, but there was no evidence that he did. And
Okay.
yeah.
And then another thing is that is discussed a lot by people that closely follow the story is not long after the inquiry was announced and began, his sister Cassandra was kind of like the face of the family, speaking publicly. She'd be on the news a lot talking about this. She was arrested for I believe for an assault not long after the inquiry started, and of course that made its way to the news, this arrest. But I know there's been updates with that.
Sure has.
What is the story with
Yeah,
her?
so this was last year on the anniversary. On January 3rd, Cassandra and her cousin were at Dooley's in Antigonish having a quiet drink and a quiet night, just telling some stories to each other and consoling each other basically. And some guys came in all hyped up and caused trouble. Anyway, trying to pick up the girls, and they didn't want any part of it, and it turned into a physical altercation. A guy had ended up in the hospital with a serious wound, alleged to have been a stabbing. The more likely cause was he went through landed on a glass door, fell out or something that he landed on. So he probably got a piece of glass in him.
Because what came to the news was that she was arrested for a stabbing. So that was how it came.
Attempted murder, right? And so it was very serious. But there was video of the whole thing. The bartenders backed her story up, that the guys were the aggressors. They were really drunk. They were probably on some drugs, and they were the ones that were being aggressive. Anyway, she was charged nevertheless, and just I think 2 weeks ago found not guilty of all charges. But all right, think of these things again, right? Think of these things through a racial lens. Here it is, a strong, outspoken Black woman, and making changes, making waves, And here was a way to knock her down a peg and
discredit her a little bit.
she'd never have been charged. There was never a knife found, nothing like that. And like I say, a whole thing on video, but they charge her anyway, make her go through the trial, but resoundingly found not guilty.
Wow. And, and that doesn't make it in the news. It's always funny when she's arrested. Lionel Desmond's sister, attempted murder, it's a big story, found not guilty. I didn't hear a peep about that.
Well, and you can imagine how that would take the good out of you too, as an advocate, and you have your own struggles. She's a single mom, and she's got one of her other relatives living with her now too, supporting him in high school. Like, she's got a lot on her shoulders. She's going to school, trying to better herself, and trying to do all these things at once. And that's what she gets.
Wow. I'm sad to say, I'm not surprised to hear that card or that hand of cards were dealt to her.
Yeah, it was something else. But so she's been having a good few weeks here lately. With the report has its problems, but the inquiry is now complete, and the recommendations are there, ready to be implemented, ready to help families. So she's very satisfied about that, and she's got her freedom too. So
good.
That's no longer hanging over her head.
Before we start wrapping it up, Paul, do you got any other questions for Adam about that, or any other talking points you want to get into about the Desmond case before we start?
No, I think he's covered it quite well. I've had a nice rest here. Thank you. No, the charges, these sort of discretionary charges that are laid in sort of controversial cases is a real problem. I mean, we saw it in Portapic with Leon Jodry being charged for something that was penny ante, which served to discredit him, and charges against Lisa Banfield being laid, which served to protect her, and then are effectively dropped afterwards. So it's the RCMP using charging in almost a political way, which is very disturbing.
Adam, is there any part of Lionel's story or the inquiry or the recommendations that you think it's important to talk about that we didn't?
No, just the seriousness of making sure that these changes take place. It continues on. I mean, Canada was asked to go to Mali in Africa to fight, a couple of years ago, and kind of demurred on it. But it's going to keep happening. The world is not a safe place. There's places where this is going to be, and we've got to get better at this. I've said elsewhere, there were no deaths in Lionel's company in Afghanistan, but 8 committed suicide upon their return, because of the PTSD, the memories, the difficulty transitioning back into civilian life. And here we have highly qualified individuals with skill sets, leadership attributes, all these things that could be very, very valuable if we can reintegrate them properly. And if we're going to continue to have a strong military, we have to get this right.
I think that's a good way to end it. Paul, before we put a bow on it, anything else you want to say? Anything you want to ask the public?
Well, I know there's a couple of military people listening to this tonight. I've talked to them and I told them this was going on. I'd encourage them and others to come forward. As I said last week, come forward, tell us what's going on. We can talk about it. I think it's an important issue. And it's all the same issue about sort of the health of the institutions in Canada.
Yeah.
And it has everyday consequences, right down to, every one of us is affected by the fact that these institutions don't work properly.
And I think the Desmond case is just an example of how bad it can go and how bad the system is right now to protect people, coming out of it.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll end with that, guys. Adam, I appreciate you answering all these questions. I know it's unique. Like, as we talk now, up until now, it's generally in the context of you being a subject matter expert on the legal cases or public inquiries in whole, in general. But in this conversation, you're involved in an altogether different way. So I appreciate you talking about it with us.
Well, glad to have the opportunity, guys. I mean, this is a big part of my life for, 6, almost 7 years now too. And I learned a lot from it on inquiries, on the military, on all sorts of things. So it was a great experience from my perspective, and glad to be able to hopefully make some positive changes in in the world at large.
I want to thank you for joining Adam, Paul, and myself for this discussion. If you have any thoughts or opinions on the stories we discussed this week, or have any topics you'd like to recommend for future episodes, you can share them with us via a voice memo sent at nighttimepodcast.com/contact. Now I'm going to wrap up this episode, but before I do, let me end with some thanks. First, a big thanks to Adam and Paul for sharing another evening with me and with you, the listeners of Nighttime. I'd like to thank LJ from the Dystopian Simulation podcast, who provides our intro and outro voiceovers, and Monty Data, who provides the music for this series. And then lastly, but of course most importantly, a massive thank you goes out to each and every one of you listening to Nighttime, as without your interest and your support, this show would be as pointless as it would be impossible. Now, on the topic of support, let me thank the newest subscribers to the Nighttime Podcast Premium feed. Gail, Adam, and Tiffany, thank you for going premium. And for anyone else who'd like to support the show, you can help us out here in a variety of ways. First of all, a premium feed subscription costs just a couple dollars a month, and that money funds the creation of the show, but the premium feed also gives you the episodes 2 days early, gives them to you ad-free, and gives you access to a full back catalog of Nighttime episodes. If that sounds like something you're interested in, you can go premium right now at patreon.com/nighttimepodcast. And even if you don't want to go premium, you can still support the show by simply sharing this episode on social media and letting all your like-minded friends know what we're doing here. Your support is very much appreciated. Now, to close this all off, let me just remind you to take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and let me know if you see anything weird.
The Nighttime Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Jordan Bonaparte.